There we go.
That was good.
I couldn't resist
No,
it.
that was good. That was good.
I think I just got it.
Tell me the part of that.
Now, if I make any mistakes, they're there for longevity.
Put them in there for just the fun of it, right?
That's right, exactly. I'm just trying to catch everybody.
Exactly, see if you're paying attention. It's a test.
And we also jumped a screen.
Change slides. There you go.
All right, so what is DMR? DMR was an open mobile radio standard that was devised in Europe. It was originally designed for commercial use. Testing, 1, 2, 3. That's a little louder. Everybody in the back just woke up.
Sound technician here.
That's right. So now I'll talk really quietly.
No.
DMR was an open radio standard developed in Europe around 2005 for commercial use. And the idea behind it was there were some other digital formats that were out there, but they were all very proprietary. The technology was owned by manufacturers, specific manufacturers, and they weren't licensing it for anybody else. So they wanted to come up with something that could be used universally by any manufacturer, but they could also be protected so that it would remain usable by any manufacturer. They kind of did that and kind of didn't. They achieved their goal and then broke it at the same time. We'll talk about that a little bit. It was designed with 3 tiers of service, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. For amateur purposes, we're interested in tier 3. That's where our technology falls in. And that was developed around about 2012 or so was when that really came in full force. DMR was officially adopted for amateur use in 2010. And that was because it had high availability, and that led to widespread adoption. Their goal, of course, was to make it available to any manufacturer. And so all the manufacturers, all the major players picked it up. And that was a good thing. It would become a bad thing. Differing from traditional analog, it uses a 2-slot TDMA in 12.5 kilohertz channels. Anybody want to holler out the bandwidth on 2 meters? It's the 2 meter bandwidth.
4.5.
8 megahertz. No, 144 megahertz.
The bandwidth of a channel?
Audio.
Oh, the audio channel?
4.5.
On FM, yes, on FM.
Oh.
4.5. Thank you.
So the idea behind this was they wanted to come up with a technology that would allow them to get double usage out of the bandwidth space and would allow them to use a narrower band than was used traditionally. Now, keeping in mind this was developed commercially where bands were pretty wide. Wideband FM wasn't unusual in the commercial world. So some of the numbers that you're going to see are going to make you go, what? And that's because they come from the commercial world and they've been adapted for our use. It uses a proprietary AMBI version 2 codec, and that is long speak for it is a protected codec, meaning that there are copyright laws and protections in place, meaning that if you get licensed to use it, you can't change it. And the idea being interoperability. So manufacturer A can make a radio, manufacturer B can make a radio, and they're both going to be able to talk to each other because they use the same codec going in and coming out. That's the part that worked. The next point is the standard allows for proprietary functionality. They decided that they wanted to allow people to develop it moving forward, and they know that most development comes from manufacturers. They've got the money to do the R&D, they've got the willingness to know what their market wants. And so unfortunately, DMR allows manufacturers to add things in to the standard. So one radio may support features that another radio doesn't, which is where I say the failure point is. That's where the interoperability falls off. Luckily for us, it's not in the voice portion of DMR. The voice portion is pretty locked down. It's in the data portion, and that doesn't so much apply to amateur use. And we're going to talk about that just a little bit. And the last point to make is that standards are still being developed and revised. DMR is not set in stone. It is a living standard. They're constantly reviewing things, adding functionality, doing new things, moving forward. So as technology changes, DMR should keep step with technology. And that was the idea behind it as well. So in 2005, some potential manufacturers got together and formed an agreement to establish some common standards for interoperability. This was, again, the idea of DMR. Now, DMR sort of predated that, but not in the form that, not in any form we'd recognize. Does anybody know when D-Star got started? It was actually in the late 90s, believe it or not. I don't know if anybody was using anything reminiscent of it back then. It got started in the late 90s, but the form of D-Star that we recognize came about in 2004. So D-Star as we know it and DMR are roughly the same age. D-Star is a bit of a predecessor though. And that's why D-Star in some forms uses some older hardware, because it was developed much earlier on and then adapted using existing standards that were in place, like I said, since the 90s. That's kind of good and bad. Most of the D-Star hardware that's out there is pretty solid. It's been tried, it's been tested, and it does what it's supposed to do. In 2009, the MOU members, all these manufacturers that got together, agreed to create the DMR Association. They said, hey, look, it's fine for all of us to get together and say we want to do this, but somebody needs to be in charge. Somebody needs to head up the operation. They need to approve the standards as they come out. They need to determine who gets in the group and who doesn't. Make sure manufacturers stick to the agreement. And that was the point of the DMR Association. Their formal interoperability testing began in 2010. So within a year, they were up and running and doing what they were supposed to be doing. Today, there are approximately 40 members in the MOU, give or take, and those are mostly manufacturers. Why I don't see 40 different brands of DMR radio, I don't know. But they're in there and they're making decisions and they're contributing to the future of DMR. Remembering that this comes from commercial roots, this is a quote that I borrowed from Mike KE8OKO of the Rocky Mountain Ham Radio Association. He says, if something about DMR for amateur radio doesn't make sense, remember that DMR was created for commercial use and was never designed nor intended for amateur radio use. And every time you get a little bit frustrated or something's a little wonky or doesn't quite go right or takes 2 tries, just blame it on this. I find it's a little convenient. So amateur radio usage, DMR is available in VHF and UHF bands. It is not available in HF. Anybody want to take a stab on why?
Bandwidth?
Exactly. Bandwidth is too wide. So if you were to take something this wide bandwidth and throw it in the HF bands, you'd have a whole lot of pissed off hams. It was started for amateur use by an organization called DMARC around 2010. And DMARC developed one of the first major global DMR networks. Very popular still today even. Amateur radio use also requires coordinated identification numbers. So anybody who wants to use DMR needs to go and register their call sign to get an ID number. You can have more than one. If you have, for instance, if you have a repeater and you want to operate, you can have 2 of them. They do try to limit it to 2 unless you have a really good reason. Now, if you're a repeater operator, you're setting up a group of repeaters, you got 6 or 7 of them, you can get special permission, but for the most part, everybody's limited to 2. And then of course, amateur radio usage is governed by the DMR Association, if governed is a good word for that. So most of the manufacturers abide by it, and so we're stuck with the technology they make us, and therefore we're basically following the DMR Association guidelines. So we talked about DMR Mark briefly. That is a major DMR network. And DMR networks are centralized systems. They allow us to use DMR technology to talk around the globe. They're comprised of master servers that provide talk groups for us to use, and we'll talk about those in a minute. Individual nodes in the system are connected by TCP/IP, which means they're connected by computer networking. And the first thing that most people think of is the internet. And that's a good place to go because it's the most common way to connect different masters and different nodes. But it's not the only way. Private networks work just as well. Closed networks work just as well. So a company could, in theory, set up their own repeaters, network them privately, and use them within their own organization. Now, of course, if they're in the amateur band, it's got to be open for people to listen and get on and that kind of thing. But the idea is that the network itself can be closed. And that's going to be important in a little bit because it's going to explain why there's so many different networks out there, because there's a lot of different viewpoints about how a network ought to be run or how they ought to be comprised. You know, how many master servers should be? How should the global network look? What are the failure points? How do we avoid those? And there's a lot of different approaches to that. And anybody who does anything with computer networking can kind of imagine where we're headed with that. Networks can be interconnected. So just because you're connected to, for instance, DMR Mark, it doesn't mean that you can't talk to somebody who's on, for instance, Brandmeister, another one of the main networks. They are very often connected to one another. It doesn't mean that every single talk group is going to be available, though. It's only going to be the ones that are made available by somebody. So for instance, if I really like a particular talk group on DMR Mark, but my repeater is set up on Brandmeister, I can create a connection to that particular talk group and bring it in. Or I could connect to an entire repeater in another network and bring it in. Services may also be interconnected. By services, I mean other types of digital. So System Fusion, D-Star, anything else really, P25, NXDN, you name them. They can all be interconnected because at the end of the day, they all rely on TCP/IP networking. So everything is a node. All we have to have is some computer system somewhere that can translate one to the other. And that's all it takes. Typically, we call them bridges. So that's kind of a cool thing about how this is set up. So don't think that you're necessarily married to one network. It's not necessarily a competition between them, although some people try to make it out that way. Another thing to keep in mind is that network operators have a whole lot of latitude. There's not a lot of rules about how you put these networks together. There's not any real rules about the hardware that you use or the types of failovers that have to be in place or the types of connections that you allow or disallow from any of the other networks. It's very, very much open to the person who designs and builds the network. And many of them are actually run by individuals, not organizations, which is another interesting point. So even though it's a centralized system, it doesn't necessarily have centralized control across the globe as a whole for DMR. It's very specific to each network. So DMR Mark, which we've mentioned a couple of times now, was basically the first network. Brandmeister, I've also mentioned, is probably at this point the largest. I tried to get some good statistics for this presentation, and the best that I could come up with was a comparison of the number of repeaters and nodes in place and the number of registered users. And we're going to see some info on that at the end. But that's where that claim comes from. Brandmeister is probably the most popular. If you Google around for talk groups for a particular topic, usually Brandmeister is what pops up. So if that's any indication of what people are using, that's why I say that. TGIF, another very popular up and coming network. I've noticed it's a little bit exclusive. The guys that use that seem to have issues with the other networks, and I'll let that fall where it may. Phoenix, UK is probably the biggest DMR network in Europe. Free DMR is another fairly well-known network. It's, again, designed to be sort of open, run by nobody. Everybody can pitch in their 2 cents, that kind of a thing. I guess I'd compare it to like open source software in a sense, the way they're trying to, the ideals that they're trying to run it with. And then others, there are many, many others. Some of them are very big networks, some of them are very small networks. Like I said, you can have your own network in your own neighborhood. And there are groups that do that. Some of the MCOM groups. I know North Texas, for instance, has their own DMR network for their Sky1 and Aries groups. That's all that uses it. So it's essentially a closed network just for their emergency communications because they have so many tornadoes and storms down there.
Yeah.
And hurricanes.
They have so many what?
Tornadoes, storms, hurricanes, weather events, yeah. So they keep their own network to make sure that it's open. That kind of brings us to talk groups. As I said, each network provides master servers that make the talk groups available to us to use. Talk groups are similar to reflectors if you use D-Star or System Fusion. They are what determines where conversations happen. So they're not actually in hardware, they're in software. So you don't necessarily have to have a specific piece of hardware to host a talk group, but you do have to have hardware somewhere hosting it. They can be monitored by anybody. There's no way to lock anyone out. There's no way to make it exclusive to particular organizations or groups or peoples. There's no privacy codes. There's no way to do that. Anybody can jump in at any time. The talk groups are generally going to be regional or topic based. And for the most part, when you join a talk group, you kind of want to stick to that. They may have a specific language that you're supposed to speak in there. They may have a specific set of topics that they like to talk about. But again, they can be monitored by anyone. So anything goes. It's a form of etiquette. It's a matter of etiquette to abide by what the creator of that room has gone for, or the creator of that talk group has gone for. But if conversation happens to turn to something else, you know, don't feel like you need to jump ship and move to a different talk group, as long as you you know, keep it within reason and the group's not busy. Talk groups have IDs just like users do. Generally, the regional ones are 2 to 4 digits long, and the topical and local ones are 5 to 6 digits long. Typically, topical is 5 digits, and local repeaters, local groups are 6 digits.
Shush.
Sorry. So here's some examples of some talk groups, and I went with Brandmeister again because those are the ones most people associate with. As mentioned, the 2 to 4 groups are regional. So 2-digit 91 is the worldwide talk group. You can jump on there and talk to people from pretty much any country on the planet that has use on amateur radio. And I've seen people in there from countries that we're not actually allowed to talk to. So just kind of a side note, you do have to be careful when people jump in there because it is worldwide. People from the UK may be allowed to talk to people from North Korea, but we obviously can't do that. So you do have to be a little careful. But for the most part, it's people in areas where we have agreements. 3100 is the group for US. That is the US countrywide. And you can find people in there from all 50 states. And the idea is that it's generally people who are either from the US or are in the US, or who just really want to talk to somebody from the US and make that contact. But it's typically going to be people that are in the US. Most of the people you're going to find in here are going to be US based. So if you have a hard time with accents, something like that, this is a good place to hang out and find people pretty active. 3139 is the Ohio statewide talk group. And as you can see, we're narrowing down those regions. And as the numbers get more specific, that's where you get more specific on the region. So we started at 3100 for US, now we go to 3139 for Ohio. And as we drill down more and more numbers on that, we're going to get deeper and deeper in that particular region. So the next one down is one that I picked, and for no real specific reason. 31390 is the Ohio TAC talk group, and we added the 0. 31391 is a group. 39312 is a group. 31392 is a group. So those are all going to be something to do within Ohio. If you want to know what groups are available, the best place to go is the web page for whatever network you're on. If you're on Brandmeister, hit up their website. DMR Mark, hit their website. These change somewhat daily. A lot of them have been around for a very long time, and they're really not going anywhere. But some of the local ones change from time to time. Typically, a local one is issued when somebody sets up a repeater. So for instance, the next one down, Springfield Local, that's the KE8XB repeater over in New Springfield, and that's the group associated with it. So your mileage may vary on groups, but there's typically going to be a master list on the website. You can find those. And again, I mentioned you can kind of go cross service. So the next one down, 31399, is the bridge for System Fusion's Ohio Link group. The one below that, 31656, is the WiresX America Link group, a very popular WiresX room. So if you know somebody who hangs out on WiresX and is on America Link, and you want to talk to them and you have DMR, 31656 on Brandmeister is the place to go. That bridge, as long as it's up, keep in mind it's network equipment, it goes down from time to time, but most of the time it's reliable and you can talk to anybody on America Link. So this brings us to something that kind of confuses people, and that is talk groups, because we kind of have to have an understanding of how they operate. In DMR, there's 3 different types of talk groups. And there's a couple of caveats that we need to talk about as well. And so I'm going to try to iron out some of the confusion here that people have with DMR without getting too crazy involved in the explanation. I'm going to try to arm you with the armchair version of this so you kind of understand enough about how it works to use it. And if you want to know more, it's definitely out there, and I'm happy to talk to anybody after if you have specific questions. But when you set up a repeater, and I'm going to use a repeater as an example here, we'll talk about that in a minute, but repeaters can have 3 types of talk groups. They can be static, dynamic, or autostatic. Static talk groups are basically always on a particular time slot. DMR uses 2 different time slots. That's the TDMA that we mentioned earlier. They are transmitted simultaneously. So rather than doing what we might think of as a sideband, where you have an upper and a lower signal going out, these actually go in turn. They rotate. So time slot 1 transmits, then time slot 2, then time slot 1, then time slot 2. And it stays in that, and it's actually timed. Every 30 milliseconds, it changes time slots. And so it actually transmits both signals simultaneously over the same bandwidth. And that's the idea behind DMR, and that's one of the benefits to it. So the static talk groups are going to be set by the repeater operator, by the repeater owner, to a particular time slot. They may say, for instance, you know what, we know a lot of the users here really like to use the Ohio statewide talk group. So we're just going to leave that always on. So if you key on that repeater and you listen on that time slot, you're going to be able to hear that group all the time, and it's never going to drop off the repeater. Well, what do I mean by drop off? The second type is dynamic. So dynamic talk groups are push-to-talk activated. There are literally thousands of talk groups. If every repeater and every hotspot was listening to every single talk group at the same time, it would never work. So they had to figure out a system to allow you to connect to the ones that are being used actively and drop the ones that aren't to maximize efficiency. So dynamic talk groups are push-to-talk activated, and they'll typically listen for 10 to 15 minutes, and that is a configurable option based that the owner can do on a repeater. Typically it's 10 to 15 minutes. If you're in a particularly congested area, you know, in a large locale, they may lower that to make it a little more friendly to people. This is where some people get confused. When you jump on a talk group, typically you're going to have to key up. And when you do, your radio is going to reach out, it's going to send a request for that talk group. The repeater you're connecting to is going to ping the master, say, does this talk group exist? If it does, let's connect to it. that TCP/IP connection that we talked about, that network connection, gets activated to that talk group. And the master server begins sending those conversations, that traffic, to the local repeater, which then broadcasts it back out, and anybody listening can hear it. So if I have two radios here, if I have one and Ed has one, we both have them turned on to time slot 2 on the same repeater, and I activate a particular group, 3139 for instance, and he wants to listen to it, and he tunes it on his radio, he may start hearing it before he hits the button, because it may already be dynamically active. So that's what confuses some people. Sometimes they turn on the radio, they'll click on a contact and they'll go, I can hear it. And other times they can't. And then they start mashing the button, trying to figure out why it's not working. That's why. And so it can get a little bit weird, especially on repeaters that are extra busy or not used very often. Both of those situations can cause a little bit of confusion there. The third type of group is autostatic. Autostatic is what repeaters do to try and maximize efficiency. So if they were constantly picking up and dropping talk groups all the time, that'd get pretty hard on the software to manage what's active and what isn't. It would also be kind of a pain if you were just monitoring. If you just wanted to listen to statewide 313 on a repeater that's not very active, it kind of sucks to have to key up every 10 minutes to keep it going, which sometimes happens. The idea behind autostatic is that you don't have to do that. Whatever the last dynamic group that was added to a repeater is automatically treated as autostatic if the repeater owner has it turned on as a setting, which most of them do. That means if you key it up and nobody else keys up another new talk group, that one's going to stay active. You can just sit your radio down and you can listen for the next 2 hours, and it's going to remain active and linked as long as you're there listening to it, provided that the repeater owner doesn't have some other settings. There's some hold settings and things that they can change to affect that behavior. And some of them will drop it after an hour or two anyway. But the idea being that it'll stay connected. And that brings us to confusion point number 2. Sometimes it doesn't let go. So sometimes you can be on a particular talk group and you can try to switch. Maybe I'm on 3139 listening to Ohio and I go, no, I want to go worldwide. Or even worse, I'm worldwide and I want to go to Ohio. And worldwide's particularly busy. And you go over to Ohio, you PTT, and you're sitting there listening, and all of a sudden you get traffic from 91 worldwide again. You're like, what's happening here? That's because the repeater didn't let go of the autostatic group when 91 was set. And the way to force it to do that is to make a group call to talk group 4000. All of the 4000 numbers from 4000 to 5000 are reserved in the DMR system, as well as a few others from 99 down are also reserved. But keying up 4000 is going to drop whatever autostatic group is currently there and force it to become dynamic again, which means that you can change to another one. So what that means is it's not necessarily going to stop listening to that group. If you caught what I said, it didn't drop it all the way. It made it from static or autostatic to dynamic, which means that that repeater is still going to listen and serve those talk groups for at least 10 to 15 minutes. But it's going to allow you to create another autostatic one because you only have one at a time per time slot.
Would it be another dynamic or another?
It would be another autostatic. So anytime you key up, the very last group that was keyed up is going to be autostatic. Now, if you have multiple people using it at the same time, it's not going to just keep flipping autostatics. Whatever one's autostatic is going to remain autostatic as long as it's in use. So that's where things get a little hairy as well. And that's why I said busy repeaters can act a little funny too. Because you can say, well, I thought I switched off, everything was fine, and now I'm back on it again. And that's because it can sometimes hold on. But the long and short, the takeaway here is if all else fails, do a quick group call to 4000. And that's going to force the repeater to let go of anything that's autostatic and then try keying up your talk group again, and you'll usually be okay. The caveat here is you can only transmit on DMR when the channel is open. Asterisk, we're going to talk about that later. if you're doing it right, you can only transmit it when the channel's open or when the channel's free. So if someone's in the middle of a QSO and someone's transmitting, and that, in other words, that time slot is active, it's not going to let you talk on that same time slot. So how do I key up to call this group if someone's having an active chat and they're not given any space? And the answer is, you can. And that's one of the chief complaints that people have about DMR. And the solution is, be nice. When you're talking, give a little space. You know, give a little space between transactions. When we're on the repeater, we like to let the repeater hang up on us. When you're on DMR, you're not going to hear it. You're not going to hear it let go. But you need to give it some space between transmissions anyway, especially in an active group. And if you do that, you'll go a long way toward making happy DMR users all around the world. So I was trying to figure out how I wanted to approach some of these topics tonight, because like I said, I don't want to get too technical and jump into a lot, but you do need to be aware that time slots and color codes exist, and you do need to understand how to use them. Time slots work behind the scenes. Like I said, they alternate in the way that they transmit the two time slots in order to overlay two signals over the same frequency, over the same transmission. And so you can kind of ignore that they're there in a sense. They're going to do what they're going to do. The hardware is designed to use them. And as long as you're aware that they exist, that's kind of all you need to know. You don't necessarily have to understand how they work or even why they work. Just kind of know that they're there, and that's what makes the multiple conversations possible. And I say they don't matter with a little asterisk because they tend to not matter if you're in simplex mode. We're going to talk about that in a little bit of detail when we get there. But then sometimes they do. As I said about manufacturers, they have a little bit of latitude in how they implement some of these things. And while time slot's not supposed to matter in simplex, some manufacturers have made it so that their radios only respond on one time slot when they're in simplex. Technically in simplex, your radio should be using both time slots. Sometimes some radios even refer to it as time slot 0, but it's really using both of them combined. So the long story short on time slots is your radio needs to match the settings of the repeater or hotspot that you're accessing. If your repeater owner says that a specific time slot should be used for a specific purpose, you should kind of adhere to that. Like the one in New Springfield, they do not want you keying up dynamic groups on time slot 1. They'd like all dynamic conversations to be on time slot 2. Time slot 1 is reserved for the local groups that are statically assigned to it. And they also don't want anybody transmitting APRS on time slot 1, which we'll talk about kind of briefly. So you just kind of want to abide by the rules. Again, it's radio and the rules aren't set in stone. If a repeater operator says to use time slot 2 for particular talk groups and you key it up on time slot 1, the repeater's going to listen to you. It's going to pick it up and it's going to work. But keep in mind that the owner may have set up settings to make them work efficiently, however they're programmed. So you should try to adhere to that. And most repeater owners will post that information pretty readily. A lot of them have it on Repeater Book. A lot of them, have their own web pages. If the repeater is run by a local club, it's typically going to be on their website somewhere. Usually pretty easy to come by. Color codes are numbered from 1 to 10, and they can be thought of kind of like CTCSS codes or DCS codes, only for digital. And what I mean by that is, if a particular transmitter is set to use a particular color code on a time slot, let's say time slot 1, color code 2, and you try to listen to that transmitter, you're not going to hear it unless your color code is set the same. And this is because it came from the commercial world where they have privacy codes on the radios. If any of you have used like FRS or GMRS, it's really similar to that. We know from amateur radio that the privacy codes are the same CTCSS frequencies, but they're not given that vocabulary. They call them color codes, and it works slightly differently. It actually is digitally applied. It's not a subaudible tone. It's digitally applied. The packets are marked in a specific way, and that is all governed by DMR Association. But you can kind of think of it the same way. So if you're trying to talk to somebody, especially simplex, you want to make sure you're on the right color code. If you're talking to a repeater, you want to make sure you're using whatever color code is set by that operator for that particular time slot. And it must match on both the receiving side and the transmitting side. So you got to have it end to end. Typically can be found in documentation, but keep in mind the last one, these can be monitored by anyone. So if you want to listen to a particular repeater and you don't know what the talk group is or what the color code is, many radios offer a monitor mode or a promiscuous mode that'll just let you open up the squelch and listen to whatever comes through. Not every radio does that. Some of the lower end ones don't, but it's becoming a lot more popular. And typically your radio will identify what it's hearing. So if you put it in monitor mode and something comes across, it's going to tell you what color code it heard it on. So that's one way to find out if you've got a radio that does that. And that's a useful feature, as is monitor mode in general for anybody who likes to play around and just see what's happening on the airwaves. And that kind of brings me to simplex. We've mostly been talking about repeater operation, and a lot of people don't realize that DMR actually works on simplex. DMR is a transmission standard. It's not a network standard. So you can use DMR technology without being attached to any network. You don't have to be attached to DMR Mark. You don't have to be attached to Brandmeister. You don't have to even be on a repeater. Simplex works just fine. As long as both radios are capable of DMR, they can talk to each other. It's more useful than people give it credit for. When we think of simplex, we typically think analog. And I would argue that might be a little unfortunate. There are some advantages to digital that we're going to talk about before we're done, and why I say that there are some situations when digital simplex may be better than analog simplex. And I'm doing this from a perspective of DMR, but I'll make that statement for all digital modes. That's true of System Fusion, it's true of D-Star. There are situations when digital simplex is better than analog. If you do use it, stick to the band plan. There's really nothing worse than scanning across where you expect to hear analog traffic and catching some crazy digital traffic. Especially if you key up on 5.2 or something like that, people are going to be pretty mad if you're throwing a digital signal out there. There are 6 frequencies that are identified by the band plan currently for digital mode traffic. This is not specific to DMR. This is for D-Star, it's for System Fusion, all of them. They're here, and I've listed them for you. And I'll make this available for the website as well if anybody wants it. But these are the channels that you want to, or the frequencies that you want to use. The convention when you're on simplex, as I said, you have to match those ends. The convention is to use talk route 99. Anything 99 and under does not route over the open network. So if you key up on a repeater on talk route 99, your traffic is not going to go out to the global network. It's going to stay within the repeater. What the repeater does with it from there is up to the repeater, but it's not going to go out globally. For that reason, they chose a reserved talk route for simplex, and that's conventionally going to be talk route 99. Now, does that mean you're stuck with 99? No, it's an open standard. If Ed and I are out and we're in the woods hunting and we want to talk and we want to use talk route 10, we could totally do that, and it would work. Probably not a good idea, because if one of us needed to call for help, nobody would ever hear us because nobody's going to be listening on talk route 10. But the idea there is you could use anything. This is the convention. Same thing for time slot. Time slot 1 is the convention on that. As I said, most radios are going to treat simplex as dual slot. Most of them are going to transmit it on both time slots, time slot 1 and time slot 2, no matter what you have it set to. Some radios do not. And for that reason, they've sort of just made the convention of time slot 1 as the one to use. So if you're working on something, you're having a hard time getting someone to hear you on the other end, check your time slot, make sure that it's the same. And same for color code 1. Again, that's the convention. You could use any of the 10, but the convention is time slot 1. So if you jump on one of these 6 frequencies and you want to hear someone driving down the highway, these are the settings you're going to want in order to do that. Which brings me to column number 3, admit criteria. What the heck is that? We haven't talked about that. Admit criteria is a setting in your radio that determines when it's allowed to transmit. And it's set by you. There are typically 3 settings: always, channel free, or color code free. Always means that your radio is going to transmit anytime you hit the PTT. Seems good on the surface until we remember that DMR is designed not to step on each other. We're not supposed to be able to transmit over top of somebody else. And so if you're set to always, it lets you do that. That's a problem. Number 1, because some people just get happy on the PTT. But number 2, if your radio is using APRS and you're pinging every so often, you could easily stomp on somebody when they're in the middle of a conversation, because your radio is not going to check to see before it sends out that APRS transmission. If you're set to the second one, channel free, it's going to hold it until that channel is available. And it's going to send it as soon as there's an opening. And that's what we prefer. So whenever you can, whenever feasible, you should use channel free. And really that should work anytime. I would argue the only time to use always, if there's ever one, would be an emergency where you really needed to get out on a frequency and people just wouldn't make room. And somebody might hear you and get a break in the conversation. But I'm really splitting a hair there to make that an option. Best rule is to stay channel free. Color code free, it works a little differently, and it's actually going to ping the repeater that you're connecting to on the color code that you have set and ask if that color code is available and if a time slot is free that uses that color code. So that's a little bit of extra insurance if you're on a repeater system, because again, a repeater is going to listen to each color code. So if I'm on color code 5 and I'm on time slot 2, and Ed keys up on color code 7 on the same time slot, he's going to walk on top of me because the repeater is going to go, oh, different color code. Cool. Color code free is going to make sure that doesn't happen. So it's going to make sure that there's a free color code and a free time slot before it allows transmission through. So the rule of thumb here, if you're working on a repeater, set your radio to color code free. If you're working simplex, set it to channel free. And that's the best rule of thumb for everybody. So now we have to mention the dreaded code plugs. Many people have lost sleep over code plugs. Anybody? Everybody is good? So code plugs are one of the things that people hate about DMR. And there are some radios that are fairly complicated to program. A code plug is basically radio software that contains a mix of radio settings and contacts. It basically tells your hardware how to use a particular network, how to interact with particular repeaters. It's a little bit more than just a contact database. It's a little bit more than just keying in some frequencies and settings. It typically controls the entire functionality of the radio. And you have to remember, DMR came from the commercial world. And in the commercial world, you don't buy open radios. You get a radio, you send it off to someone to have it programmed for your organization with your frequency allocations, your privacy codes, whatever it is, and everything comes back to you ready to rock. And you turn it on, you hit the button, and that's all you ever worry about. And if something needs to change, you send it back to the guy that sold it to you and he programs it again. This code plug idea kind of came from that world. It's a plus and a minus. it's a plus in the fact that you have tons and tons of control over how the radio works. And it's very easy to make sure that two radios are functionally identical. So if you have a group of people that all work Mahoney County areas and you decide you want to use DMR, you can take a whole bunch of people and make all the radios functionally the same. And there's never any confusion about whether or not somebody's on the right Simplex channel, whether or not somebody's color codes are right, because everything came out of the same programming. Some of the downsides are is it is model specific. So if you have a particular radio, even within manufacturers, it may not work with the next type of radio. Again, kind of comes from that commercial world where people tend to buy 20, 30, 40, 50 of the same model, and they're not really using a bunch of different stuff. And so that is one of the things that is kind of a downfall. They can be easily shared. The asterisk there is because two things. Number one, they are different for every model. So if you have your program, you know, I have an Anytone 878 right here. If I wanted to share this code plug with Frank and he's running the TYT, which I think is what you have, he can't take my code plug. It's not going to work. Couple of ways around that. Most programs will let you export just channels or, you know, some of this data in other formats, CSV formats typically, and you can import it into the other software. But doing a clone from one radio to another is not going to be possible. The other reason they can't easily be shared is because one of the things you have to do when you set this radio is put in your DMR ID. It's saved in the radio. When I export the code plug, that DMR ID is part of that code plug. So if I were to send it over to Ed, for instance, and he has the same radio I do, as soon as he loads that up, it's going to have my DMR ID on it. So anytime I want to share that, I have to remember to go in there and delete it out before I send him that file. And that's not always done. Some people don't do that. So if you find one on the internet, make sure you go through the settings before you just start keying up. Another thing that confuses people is code plugs are not actually required. Some radios, very few, especially early on, required code plugs to operate. But most radios now, they don't require them. You can pull it out of the box, you can turn it on, put it in VFO mode, key in a few settings from the front panel, and start talking on DMR without ever programming the radio. The only thing you have to do is enter that DMR ID. You can also purchase them with the radio. The most famous one for this is Bridgecom. Bridgecom, if you buy a radio from them, they're going to send you about 35 emails, 3 or 4 phone calls, and probably knock on your door to try and get you to buy their super code plug for your radio. I will say it is worth the price. I will also say it's a little bit annoying if you've ever made 2 purchases from them. You think they'd mark in their paperwork somewhere that you've already bought from them and probably don't need it, but you'd be wrong. And then the last thing is that they can be built fairly easily. And I say this a little bit tongue in cheek because some of the earlier softwares were a little bit complicated and they were a little bit hard to use. And they are, most of them are Chinese software. I don't think I need to go into a whole lot of detail on what that means. It's not always completely intuitive, and the language and the labels in the software are not always
translated
perfect English. And that, I think, is what drives a lot of confusion. The other confusion is there's a lot of latitude in how you set up your radio. Like I said, code plugs aren't actually required to operate. So when you design one, they don't have to have a specific type of structure in order to work. And for that reason, I didn't really want to get into code plugs too deeply, other than mention that they're there. And you should make one for your radio if you plan on using it a lot, but it's not completely necessary. So some confusing points. Vocabulary differs from manufacturers. Some manufacturers will call something a zone. Some will call it something else. Some will say admit criteria for a channel. Some will say something different. Sometimes it's different within the software. That's true of the Anytone. Anybody who's ever used that software, the language, the vocabulary changes throughout the programming. One of the real confusing parts about the Anytones is they actually use channel twice. Contact. Contacts can be a personal contact, which is a DMR contact. When you, almost like caller ID, when someone transmits, their transmission is tagged with their DMR ID. So your radio is going to show you that ID when they talk. You can program the memory on your radio to translate that into a call sign and a name and a location, so that you don't just see the numbers. That is called a contact, and that makes sense. When you start programming channels in here, memory channels, they also call those contacts, because somebody thought that was a good idea. So that's where some of the confusion arises, is in the vocabulary. The actual setup isn't all that bad. But don't let these things push you away from DMR. These are things that can be addressed, they can be worked through, and with 1 or 2 times through it, those kinds of confusions will go away. So don't let that hold you out. So what I need to do to get started: register for your DMR ID on radioid.net, buy a DMR capable device. $100 to $200 typically is what's going to run you to get the radio and the battery charger and the typical things you're going to need. And then you need to connect to a repeater or a hotspot if you want to get on one of the global networks. If you go with the repeater route, we're lucky we have one here that's in range. If you want the hotspot, that's going to run you extra, obviously. And that lets you connect to any network that you want. If you don't want to connect to Brandmeister and you want to connect to TGIF, fire up your own hotspot, connect it to whatever network you want. You're in control. You're in control of the static groups. You're in control of all of that. So how do we make a QSO? Pretty simple. Choose a frequency, match the color codes with whatever repeater or hotspot you're on, or the other person on the other end of Simplex. Match your talk group setting to whatever you want to talk to. And then typically you're going to want to match the time slot. That's all it takes. From there, you just key up and you talk like normal. So etiquette. As I said before, you want to leave plenty of space between transmissions. You don't want to take the time, you don't want to stomp on top of people. Some people have weaker signals. Some networks run slower than others. So you want to allow space for that. You also want to allow space for people who need to unlink the talk group. That's really the biggie. Don't forget to identify. Just because your radio says who you are does not meet the FCC requirement for ID. You still have to verbally ID. If you're on one of the main talk groups, worldwide, or any of the heavily trafficked talk groups, and you want to have a longer QSO, it's a good idea to move to a different talk group. There's TAC channels for that. There's various ones. You can move to a local repeater if you want. There's places you can go to move that conversation. The next one that I advise is probably the biggest one that I can tell you. Adjust your mic gain. Most people get a radio, turn it on, and just use it, and they never take the time to set it up. And that's true of most radios. A lot of guys don't set up their mic. If you do that on digital and your mic gain's too high, you're going to get a lot of clipping in your audio, and people are going to have a hard time understanding you. And if it's too low, you're obviously going to come in and be way too quiet. When you're listening to a talk group, you're going to hear all kinds of different audio levels. It's one of the things that bugs me about digital, but that's how it goes because people don't take the time to follow this rule. So best thing you can do is test your audio first. Talk group 999 or 9998. Both of those talk groups will let you play back your audio. So you can talk into it and it's going to play it back exactly as it hears it. And you can make adjustments. There are a few online resources where you can go to a website, talk into a talk group, and it's connected to a web page. It'll actually give you audio meters, and you can adjust it that way. But if nothing else, hit up these two talk groups and adjust your mic gain. And then don't speak immediately after you key up. When you key up, give it a second, let the audio transcoder start doing its work, and then speak, and then give a little space before you let it up again. If you don't, you're going to find that a lot of your audio gets cut off either at the beginning or at the end. So give a little bit of silence, just a half a beat or a beat before you key up or after you key up and before you let off. So why choose DMR? Here's the benefits that I came up with. Superior audio fidelity. That's up to everyone's ear. Technically speaking, you get better audio on digital than you do on analog. In practice, if you have good analog and you've got good equipment on both ends, you're going to get pretty good audio anyway. But there are going to be times when, especially if you're doing, for instance, simplex at a distance, if you're at the edge of your range, you're going to get better audio on digital than you will on analog, because audio, the digital, offers error correction at a much lower power requirement. So it's going to be able to take that signal and transmit it with integrity at a longer distance, typically at a lower power. If you're in an area where there's a lot of interference, flip back over to analog. Digital does not like interference, especially multipath interference. So if you're bouncing a signal off of mountains or buildings and it's creating that signal, a situation where you're getting both of those signals coming in out of phase, switch to analog. Digital just doesn't handle that very well. It's not designed for it. That's the caveat. Pluses, you're going to get better, typically better efficiency out of the infrastructure. You can run two conversations at once over the same bandwidth. So if every repeater was on digital, we have twice as much space in the spectrum, theoretically. Longer battery life. Again, you don't need to have as much power. You can transmit longer distances on less power because you have the error correction, so you can save battery. You don't need to necessarily run on high to get clear audio. We transmit voice and data at the same time, and I have a huge asterisk here, and that's important because currently with the DMR standard, data packets are not tagged. So they are not tagged with your call sign. They're tagged with your DMR ID, but like I said, that's not good enough for the FCC. So transmitting data packets over amateur bands is actually prohibited. And so we can't use that right now on DMR. If they ever implement a tagging system with your call sign, you'd be able to transmit GPS positions, APRS, anything you want. APRS works because you're actually transmitting your call sign with that. But anything else, man down alerts, SMS messages, any of the other types of data that you can send on a radio or a pager system, you can send on DMR. It's built into the system, but we can't use it right now. Hopefully that's going to change at some point, though. Of course, it'll probably cause a lot more confusion. Availability and continuity. It's an open standard. All the manufacturers support it. It's probably not going anywhere. It's a living standard. They're constantly revising and updating it. Probably not going anywhere anytime soon. One of the other real big benefits of DMR is you can make global contacts regardless of your license class, regardless of your equipment. There's not a whole lot of ways that you can grab an HT and make contacts around the world. You need to have, if you're in an area where you can't put up a high profile antenna, you're in an HOA, maybe you're only a technician, you haven't made the upgrade yet. This is a way for you to get out and make those contacts that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. Some people complain that they're purists. They complain that it's not true radio. I'm not going to argue that. If you're into making those analog contacts around the world, go for it. There's nothing wrong with that. I think it's a great part of radio. But some people don't have the opportunity or can't afford the equipment or live in an area where it just isn't feasible. Maybe you're in Antarctica. This lets you.
No, don't go there. I've seen
well,
in Antarctica.
Point taken. So, this is an option for people who maybe can't use analog. It's another mode. If you enjoy using other modes, try it. It doesn't mean you have to give up analog. Benefits of analog on the other side is widespread adoption. I mean, pretty much any receiver on the planet works on analog. It doesn't require newer equipment. Poor signal quality can actually be cleaned up.
Good evening. Welcome to the W8QLY repeater. The time is 8:10 p.m.
If you're in a situation where you're getting a lot of interference or you have very, very low audio, analog may be a better option because you're going to get a don't say usable signal, but there's a point where digital just drops off. It works into a point until the error correction fails, and then you get nothing, no signal at all. Analog, if you get a good enough antenna and you can get it placed right, you're going to get something out of it. So in situations like that, analog is still going to be king. And then of course I mentioned it can perform better in interference environments. It just, the equipment is designed to survive that better than the digital is. Digital encoding is just not currently in a form that handles that very well. So which one do you choose? We have DMR, we have System Fusion, we have D-Star. This is based on the current number of worldwide repeaters on each type. And I did this only as a conversation point. I don't want you to think that this means that everybody should run to DMR. That's not the case. If you're in an area that has a lot of System Fusion repeaters, use System Fusion. If you're in an area that has a lot of D-Star, or you have a lot of buddies that are all in D-Star across the country, D-Star. They're going to give you very similar performance. There's some nuances, but they're going to give you very similar performances compared to analog. Use the one that works for you. If you've already got equipment that does one, stick with that one. There's enough bridges going back and forth between the networks now and between the systems that you don't have to necessarily jump on DMR because it's out there. You can kind of stick with what you like. So at this point, if we want to try and do a demonstration, we can try to key up some audio here and see what it sounds like. Does anybody have any questions while I'm doing this?
Question about the hotspot.
Yeah, go
When I
ahead.
think hotspot, I think of my phone, I turn on hotspot. Is that something different?
It is a good question. So this is one of those unfortunate reuses of a word. It is a hotspot because a hotspot by definition connects you to a network. That's what a hotspot does. We think of internet hotspots connecting us to the internet. These are radio hotspots that connect us to radio networks. Now, most of them are going to use the internet as a backbone. They're going to take our audio. I'm going to shoot it over RF to my hotspot. It's going to go out over the internet and then land somewhere else. But it does work over RF to the radio, either UHF or VHF.
No repeater. You would go RF to the hotspot. So
You got it.
Okay.
Or if for instance, I don't want to use a repeater, maybe that repeater's on Brandmeister and I want to use TGIF network. I can set up my hotspot to use whatever network I want. Yeah, or I want to do cross mode. If I want to get on D-Star, I can go cross mode with my hotspot too, but that's an advanced feature we really didn't talk about. And they come in all shapes and sizes. I have two here. These are two extremely popular ones. This one is the MMDV version. It's a cheapo. You can buy it on Amazon. It's about $60 or something. Comes with the case. You have to add a Raspberry Pi Zero. You have to do all the programming. Uses a program called PiStar. Not terribly difficult, but it gives you full control over everything and you can build it for under $100. It does most things you want. It doesn't have a battery. If you want the cream of the crop, this is the OpenSpot 3. This one is the one that does anything you want. It has a built-in battery, works fantastically well. It uses hardware to handle the audio transcoding as opposed to software on this one. So it's much more reliable. And this one does a lot of cross mode. This is the only hotspot on the planet that will cross mode to D-Star from the others. So if you want to run D-Star like true D-Star from a Fusion phone or a DMR phone, this is the one you have to have. It's the only one that does it. Now, I'm not talking about bridging with rooms or reflectors. I'm talking about actually running D-Star transcoded. This is the one that does it. But yeah, you would use that in place of a repeater. And most people do. I will say though, if you have a repeater near you, it's kind of a good idea to use it. There's only so much bandwidth on the airwaves. And there's literally right now 15,000 of these just on the Brandmeister network. And most people don't change the frequency when they come out of the box. You do the math. So, and the other problem is if you have them tied to the same room, say for instance, I have 2 of these on Ohio statewide, and we're in range of each other, it's going to double transmit into the room. You're going to get that echo effect. You know, just like if you put two phones on speaker at the same time, you're going to get that in a talk group. And it doesn't make people happy either. So you want to be judicious. There's reasons for using hotspots and they're great to have, but be judicious. You know, use it if you really need it. I keep mine plugged in my truck when I'm driving down the road. It's connected to the internet hotspot in my truck, and I use DMR driving down the highway because I've never heard anybody on 5.2. So DMR is how I travel between here and Columbus. You know, so your mileage may vary, but that's what that's for.
How much is that federal? The white one?
This one here?
Yeah, how much are those?
These are about, well, they're typically around 300. Right now, they're about 400, just because supply chains being what they are right now. Yeah.
Yeah. It's about triple.
Yes, but these are fantastic. A couple benefits too. This is obviously made out of Chinese components, Chinese board, made by who knows who. It is open source hardware, but the manufacturer obviously has control over the circuitry. This is not made in China. This is made, is this Estonia?
Estonia.
Made in Estonia.
European.
Well, you know, Russian. It's actually Eastern European. So the benefit is that if you're a person who's into NDAA compliance or just simply don't want to throw money at Chinese manufacturers, this is an option. And it's a really good one. It works really well. So
They also have a fantastic technical support. If you have any question, the guy, he'll get back to you right away. I'm impressed with them.
I've heard you talk about that before. You said you could.
Just an FYI, if you happen to call an Estonian, a Russian, or a Lithuanian, what's going to happen? Probably gonna be-
that's true.
Yeah.
Yes.
What kind of baud rate are we talking about between those?
It's actually configurable typically, but usually it's like 9600, I think, is the default.
96? Really?
Yeah, it is configurable depending on the hardware.
Wow.
I'm not sure what this one runs, but I am fairly certain these are 96.
Yeah, specs for that. Go to the OpenSpot website. It has everything.
So,
Yeah, they do have a lot of stuff on there if you're into the technical part of it.
so you probably ought to, because they call it privacy. Where you can, so the difference between that, if you wanted to have a private conversation, DMR, you know, that's
Yeah.
the private call.
So there's 2 types of calls in DMR. There's private calls and group calls. I intentionally left out private calls because in amateur radio, they don't actually work as intended. So the idea is if you're in a group, let's say we're all in a work group and we're out working on the highway and we're using DMR. If I wanted to talk to a specific person in the group without transmitting to the entire group, I can actually key up a person in a private call as long as we're in the same talk group. And I can have a brief conversation with them without everybody else hearing it. The reason I don't mention it is because in amateur radio, it doesn't actually work quite that way because we don't have privacy. So it's not actually encrypted. It's not encoded in any way. And if you're in promiscuous mode, you can actually hear all the private calls anyway. So it's not truly private. The other reason I don't mention it is because it still ties up a time slot. And to the casual listener, they're not going to hear you. And they're going to wonder why things aren't working the way they're supposed to. So it generally creates an environment where people don't have a good experience. So if you want to have a private conversation, best to move to a talk group or move to a local repeater talk group, or if you're in Simplex range, go Simplex. But the private call is usually good to stay away from, but it is there. If anybody can think of a reason to use it that I haven't come up with, I'd love to hear it because I have not thought of a good reason yet. So.
How much of this is borrowed from X.25?
I would imagine there's a lot of borrowing going on. So I know like the modulation that DMR uses actually comes from Originally, I think from RIDI, it uses FSK, frequency shift keying, for modulation. Yeah, so,
Between two tones, okay.
yeah, so, you know, I'm assuming a ton of borrowing came from other modes and previous technologies. And for good reason. They were developing an open standard. They wanted to use things that people already know about and hardware that already exists. I'm sure that's probably
Remember this stuff, thank you.
yeah, no problem. I'm hoping that's the reason behind it.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when you're checking mic gain, when you call out talk group, what you think is called parent on Brandmeister.
Mhm.
I think you transmit to the talk group and it responds back as a private call, so people listening on parent won't hear your voice who's broadcasting on the talk group. So I think it's to use that.
There's two parent groups. One of them, yes, responds as private, and one of them responds as a group.
Okay.
So there are two different ones. You'll usually see them listed as parent and parent alt. 9998 is the one that responds private. 310227 or some crazy number like that is the one that responds as a group. So if you were, say, working with a couple of other people and you wanted to test together, you could do that. But yes, generally it's going to respond as a private. And we've probably picked the one time on the planet that there's nobody in the world talking. So I'm on the repeater here in New Springfield, and I have pretty good signal. I keyed up because I have talk group 91, and talk group 91 is not a static talk group on that repeater. So I had to PTT to key it up. When I do, it transmits, and you can see now it shows me as the last caller. And there's either nobody out there talking or just not interested. Which one are you on?
Group 91.
You're on DMR?
Yeah, DMR Brandmeister.
Are you on it bridged?
I'm going through my hotspot.
Because the System Fusion bridge links to worldwide groups.
Mhm.
So if you're going through the bridge, you may be hearing System Fusion traffic.
No, it's
You're going straight through DMR?
Yep.
Go ahead and key up and see if it shows it.
because there was someone talking. Again, you get some people for chunking. They said we could always go to like the local one. KE8NSW testing.
What are you looking at on your screen?
Well,
That's your hotspot?
yeah, and I can actually see who's keying up. You saw I just keyed up. Copy that. Thanks for coming back. I see your name's Mark. Yeah, the name is Ed on this end. I see you're from Australia. Back to you. Again, you want to give it a little bit of cut. Yeah, very good. Yeah, we're actually doing a club meeting. We were doing a demonstration at DMR. So just wanted to throw out my call sign. I appreciate you coming back. You have, I believe, is it daylight or is it an evening for you? I'm not sure. So anyways, this is KE8NSW. We're going to be clear and on the side listening. Thank you very much. Yeah. So what's nice about the OpenSpot software I run, again, I have the same thing on my phone, so I can pull that up. At my house, I have a large monitor for my poor eyes. What's nice about this, when I'm using the hotspot, wherever it keys up, I just click on this call sign. It immediately is linked to QRZ. I can see
Where he's at.
where he's at. Yeah, and it's pretty neat.
That's what's nice about hotspots is they'll show you what they're actually doing. When you go through the repeater, you're kind of stuck guessing what it's doing. Now, I could go on Brandmeister's website and see if it's active, because the repeater could be down.
I want to bring that to site and see him last talk on Worldwide 91.
Yeah,
So the repeater that we're talking about is down in where?
New Springfield.
Do they have a network connection down there as well?
They're connected to Brandmeister,
Via printed pair, so to speak.
I would assume. Yeah,
They
So I
have to
just
find the
did
landline somewhere.
A group
Yeah, they're-
connect to get me on.
yeah, they have an internet connection somewhere.
I did the group 4,000 to unlink from that.
Unlinked,
Mhm.
and that's on your hotspot. You still have. to-
Correct. Well, that's the thing with
So-
DMR. Sometimes you want to make sure you disconnect from it, like you were talking.
Yeah, so the rule of thumb is if you're on a hotspot, you only really need to do that if you're on a simplex hotspot. So technically on a duplex hotspot or a repeater, it will usually auto disconnect you. On a simplex hotspot, it will not. Simplex hotspot is going to just stay connected because it assumes you're the only one using it.
No timeout.
No timeout. Now, some of them are configurable, but generally speaking, out of the box, none of them have a timeout.
What's simplex duplex as far as hotspots?
So on this one, I have it's set up as simplex. It can only do simplex because there's not two receivers in there. And I just as simplex, I transmit and receive on the same frequency. And that's nice, again, if you're running a bunch of hotspots in one area, you don't want to tie up two frequencies if you can help it. But there are duplex hotspots out there. And if you're monitoring multiple talk groups or doing something crazy like that, then it's a good idea to have one. And they act a little bit more like a repeater, although technically they do work differently in terms of the 4,000. You really shouldn't have to use it on a duplex hotspot. But again, it's DMR and your mileage may vary. So it never hurts to do it.
And what helps too with the simplex hotspots, because I have one of those, is if there's a lot of chatter, let's say on 91 or something, so you can't push to talk to drop the talk group, you can hit that hotspot on a web page and click disconnect and it drops all talk groups. And so then you push to talk and switch somewhere else.
Yeah.
So you can control locally.
And we could be experiencing the interference I was talking about. I'm getting a ton of interference off the mic. I had to move away because I could hear it coming through backfeeding. It could be killing my digital signal just from the mic.
The computers and the
Yeah.
whatever. TV,
Yeah,
whatever.
if I walk out there, it'll probably start working. So,
Could be the fluorescent lights.
yeah, it could be the fluorescent lights, anything. Digital, yeah, digital's funky with interference. So that's the downfall.
And you got no idea because it's not.
I have no idea because I can't see what the relationship between the repeater and my radio is doing. My radio says it's transmitting and it's going out, and I can see the signal going out and I can see it keying up. I can see the signal coming in and then nothing follows. So for whatever reason, could be the repeater not picking up the talk group, could be whatever. But
So if you have the Brandmeister webpage up
Yeah.
and running,
you could look at the repeater, that repeater's webpage and see what it's actively doing,
Yeah.
just like the hotspots.
so I've got the webpage up and running right now. Right now, there's 13,807, it'll change hotspots that are connected.
The Brandmeister?
Yeah. Repeaters, there's 4,513, 48 masters, and then voice calls, there's 100. And again, it changes. And this is going, around the world. And then for my hotspot, it's showing it's green. If it was red, it would tell me I'm not connected. So if you have that, by having the computer with the software, you can see what's going on also.
Is your hotspot there? I see the lights on it is green.
Yeah, right now I disconnected, so it's not connected to anything right now. So I would have to, yeah. So if I wanted to go to, right now that was homebrew, like I said, this hotspot is great because it'll allow me to go to a bunch of different modes. So I can go to System Fusion. I can tell it to switch. So that's American one. So through here, I can go to Ohio Link. I can go to American Rag Shoe, I can go wherever. So I don't want to get into fusion. I think this was just, we were talking about the DMR is enough to get into it. So we're now on, we're going to do the fusion piece. There's a lot to this.
And you're using a fusion radio?
Yeah, so there's certain radios that are fusion capable, like the 991 A or 91. That's an FTM. Let me turn that down. FTM 100, and actually I've got it connected directly through the internet. I can have that also set up. For right now, I have a dummy load on there. I can transmit back on a dummy load, and I can walk around my house with my HT and connected
Through the radio.
through the radio. To be able to connect.
So that's almost like a radio.
Kind of, a little bit different. So this is what they call a PDN node, portable digital node. And it allows me to get digital and analog. And again, I have to go through the mic and speaker. The only thing that this setup won't do is I cannot host a room. Where John has an actually HRI, it's kind of like a server that he can connect, and he can actually host his own room.
Yeah, the HRI is actually a registered node. So it would act on the network. It would be viewed like a repeater or anything else that's physically connected to it.
And
I
then
didn't bring it, so it's okay.
And again, this is how I can connect through the radio, and I can just talk with the mic, and I'm not transmitting over the air.
You're transmitting over the air.
Correct. And what's nice about this, running this software, I can actually adjust my audio without transmitting. I have to be connected to a room. So again, you need to set the quality. So KE8NSW. So that's a little bit high. I'd have to go in here on my on my speaker and drop it down.
And what software is that?
That's actually the WiresX software. So for WiresX, you have to register. It has to be a fusion capable radio. You have to give them the serial number of that radio. You send that to Yaesu, and then they send you back an ID. Yeah. But like I said, I like the hotspot because, again, it has its own battery. I can put it in the top, set it on the dash. I can do whatever mode I want with one radio. I don't have to carry 5 different radios around.
Hey, Rob, this is Rich, KB8GAE.
Hey, Rich.
Hey, you're connected to 3139 on the new Springfield machine. Let me give you a shout and see if you can hear me.
We turn back on.
What kind of radio is yours, Rob?
This is the Anytone 878, first generation. This is just a new one. So he's seeing me now. I actually connected to 3139, which is a static talk group on that repeater.
It's always available.
Always available.
On the Springfield machine.
KE8OKO, KE8GAE.
KE8GAE, KE8OKO. I hear you loud and clear.
Yeah, so it's not you there, Rod. You're in there good. I'll let you guys go on. Excellent presentation.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. 7-3. We'll talk to you later. KE8OKO.
So now we're talking through a digital conversion, correct?
No, this is going DMR to the repeater and I think he may be.
He said you were on 3139.
3139, Ohio statewide.
So you were not on, when you were trying 91, you weren't.
I switched.
Oh, okay.
When I couldn't get it working, I switched to the statewide because it was a static talk group, but I wanted to see it pick up.
The other guy.
So, Rich, were you connecting over RF or through a hotspot?
4,800 watt.
Well, forget the.
I was rolling through the repeater, Rob.
You were going repeater also? Okay, so
Yes.
we were going through the repeater. But we were going over the internet. It was not a local call. So we were going out to the repeater, over the internet, back to the repeater, back to the radio.
Now, do you want to switch to talk group 9 and do a local call?
So we were both talking on talk group 3139. That is a network connected talk group. So it was actually taking our conversation at the repeater, passing it over the network up to the master server, and then back down to anybody listening to that, anybody attached to that talk group.
Oh, yeah.
So we were going out to the, yeah, we were going global essentially.
You weren't just talking.
Correct.
Yes.
So we were actually going through the network. Now, he just asked if I wanted to go to talk group 9. If we go to talk group 9, anything 99 and under does not get transmitted over the network. It stays local. So if we switch to that,
But that would still show up if you brought up the Springfield repeater.
I'm not sure if they'll send if they show the private ones or not. I think they'll show users connected, but I don't know if they show as much info. And I saw you key up, by the way, Ed. I saw you key up on statewide.
I disconnected.
Anyway, I'm on talk group 9, Rich, if you want to try it. And actually, hold on. On this repeater, we should be on time slot 1. They want local calls on time slot 1. So I'm actually going to switch to time slot 1. And this is where you kind of just got to know which system you're using. And anybody who's on APRS.FI, by the way, you're going to know exactly where I am because I'm transmitting APRS as well. Every time I PTT, it's kicking up my APRS location because this radio has GPS.
So your APRS is going out on the other slot or on that slot?
It's going out on the same slot. I have it set in my radio to use the same slot.
So the data, your voice.
Well, APRS is a little different than traditional data because APRS, the system actually requires a call sign. So when you configure APRS on the radio, you have to key in your call sign, and then it puts it in the data packet that goes out.
So
because that's how
because it has the call
it
sign.
makes it legal, and that's because APRS is designed for amateur use. If I were to use another type of data, like for instance SMS, it wouldn't work. Yeah, it would be illegal.
Well, it would work.
It would work, but it would be illegal. Yes,
So
I can actually transmit photos too.
How does the DMR APRS, does it link with like the other APRS that the nationwide? 144.390?
So no, so that is analog APRS.
Okay.
This is going out over digital APRS. So there's a specific talk group that I don't remember off the top of my head, 314 or something, and 3142 maybe. And it goes to that talk group, and anything that hits that talk group gets sent back out to the APRS analog network by some reflector somewhere.
Because the reason I'm asking, I think the new Anytone does digital and
It does both. This does both also.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, we can finish up asking them questions here in a little bit. The other big thing we have to work with tonight is field day, which is coming up here in 2 weeks. Joe, you want to come on up? Since you're the chairman here.
All right. Something to drink, but I don't think anything.
I think the Allison on there.
So I need to talk to the computer so that everybody
Yeah,
online
just,
can hear
yeah,
me.
so they can see you.
Oh, see me with my messed up hair.
She's gonna try to test the field day.
Can't be any worse than mine.
She keeps going one day, yes. the other day, no, so I'm not sure how-
So anyway, the fourth weekend of the month, as always, we have field day. And we had a meeting last week, trying to figure out where we're going to organize and where we're going to go. And so the good news is the Mill Creek Metro Parks has given us authorization to hold our field day as we have in the past. What we have to decide as a group is, how many radios we want to do and what kind of setup we want to have. We are, I guess, starting with this, going to have a meeting next Wednesday, June 16th at this location, correct?
Mhm.
To finalize some of the details for field day. So, and tonight I just want to have a journalization and basically, toss out there anybody that's interested in operating. We're going to try to do a merged field day. By that, I simply mean we're going to have our on-site field day for those that want to come out to field day, but we're also going to allow those that want to work from home to work the club call and do it as the system
Similar to
was last year.
Mhm.
Because the FCC, they're the FCC, the ARL's letting those same rules apply for this year that
Yeah.
they did last year.
This
They've
is
announced
the
that.
W8QLY repeater. Good evening. The time is 8:42 p.m.
Somebody needs to mute their mic on this. Zoom.
Yeah, that's half the fun.
Okay, what time is the meeting next Wednesday?
7
7 o'clock. So anybody
Can we-
interested
can
in
we have
helping
it here?
set up, we would appreciate you coming out and helping take it the next level. With
That's
that,
60. Oh, I don't have nothing going on that night. I can come back now.
with that being said, and without going into a whole lot of details, we're kind of working out right now. We're thinking of either operating 4A or possibly a few more stations, depending on how many operators and how many pieces of equipment we have. I don't know if you've had more talk with other folks out there.
I've had a few more people have come forward that are willing to operate radios, so we can put up more radios. We just need the antennas. So we would like to have at least 6 antennas up for running. If we don't run 6A, then we have extra antennas, but it would be nice to have 6 antennas up just in case.
Yeah, the goal is always to have more antennas, and that gives us more flexibility. We can switch radios if needed.
Because I got the 3 that the club own, and I know Frank's pulling out of 1 or 2. And I don't know who else is bringing, maybe Rich is bringing antennas.
I'm bringing for the digital station.
Okay, so yours is covered then. So we may wind up with enough, at least 5 then.
If we've got some wire and some coax, we can make whatever we need when we're there. Aren't we supposed to be hams and make what we need,
Yeah,
right?
Isn't it field day? Set up a-
Exactly.
yeah.
I mean, we usually have the supplies there, so if we
Yeah.
gotta build something, we'll build it.
I
I don't know
guess-
if you guys, antenna guys that have built stuff.
Did we have a determination as to how public we want to make this year? We talked about it at the last meeting and kind of went in this direction. Then in a Zoom meeting last night, we kind of rethought that, and it was kind of like, well, we got to have some determination before we start doing the PR, because Mike and I are talking about trying to launch a PR effort next week sometime. And if we're not really looking to attract a lot of public, we won't really do a heavy PR effort. If we're looking to try and attract a lot of public, foot traffic, then we'll do, a maximum PR effort.
Would that be Corona dependent?
Well, that's the issue. Yeah, exactly.
Well, from the parks perspective, their facility is wide open.
Yeah.
And it's open to the public. Now, whether we publicize we're gonna be there, that's another,
That's what.
I mean,
That's what we're questioning.
right.
How much do we, how much do we advertise this?
I mean, you still do a press release to your local media because you wanna publicize it, we get
Okay, just so everybody understands what we're talking about here.
if we just put a press release out, we get the points from the field day, you know, if you look at what you do and what you get points for. If we just put a press release out, we get the points for doing PR, and then we don't have to worry about anything else we do. And if we just put a press release out, the likelihood of the press showing up is probably a little low, and the likelihood of a large contingency of the public knowing about it, let alone making the effort to show up, is probably pretty low. And we can do it that way with the idea that we really are not looking to attract a lot of people because the virus is still active in this area. Keep in mind, folks, even though we're all sitting here maskless, all right, Mahoning County is in the top 5 of the counties out of 88 counties in the state of Ohio. Okay, it's one of the higher counties as far as case count still. This virus hasn't gone away, even though, you know, probably everybody's vaccinated or whatever in this room. So the risk factor is still there. And if we attract anybody in the public, there's risk factor. Now, high risk factor, low risk factor, you know, who knows? But given that the population of this club is usually older people, okay, number one. Number two, given that we don't know who we'd be attracting in the public, the last time we talked about this topic at the meeting that Joe mentioned last Wednesday, okay, the approach at that time was keep it kind of low profile, do the minimum, and don't try and attract a lot of people. That's what we walked out of here last Thursday. Last night, to be quite honest with you, we had a meeting on the strategic planning group, and Rob was in there. Rob brought up some really good points in reference to, isn't field day about attracting the public, blah, 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 blah. I just put it in front of Scott and said, hey, you know, we got to figure out which direction we're going here, because we're going to launch whatever we're doing, little PR or big PR, next week. So the question on the table is, do we want a lot of public there, or even the potential of attracting a lot of public, or don't?
And given the short notice, do we want to have the hassle of trying to get it in for the public?
Yeah, yeah, because quite honestly, it's going to take more work.
Yeah,
I'm going to be the devil's advocate on this. Okay, what are you afraid of?
Getting sick. I think one of the things that I don't want to say be afraid of, but kind of was that.
You're afraid of it?
Yeah.
Then don't go.
Will we have anybody? So Joe Q Public walks in and gets ignored.
Is that good? Have them wear a mask?
No. Irrelevant of the virus.
Yeah, I'm saying, what if we don't have anybody there from our club to go talk to that guy?
What's the point of attracting?
Ham radio.
Yeah, okay. That's part of the reason you do
Usually when we have a large.
But right now, what I'm seeing is we're putting what we're doing and how we're going to progress as a club to emphasize the want and the need for amateur radio and amateur radio operators, but we're putting a restriction on it because of the virus.
Don't have a choice.
But well, we do have a choice. Don't go.
Oh, well, yeah.
It's either go or don't go. If you've been vaccinated, what are you worried about?
Well, no, I see where you're coming from, but I think we're trying to, how much involvement do we want to get in provide? When we put the big PR out there, like we've done in the past, in the 2 previous field days we had, we did a substantial amount of PR to attract a lot of the public and
the media.
And don't get me wrong, a couple of years ago, we had almost as many visitors come to our field day site as we had actual members and operators. So that'll give you an idea of how many people actually came. When you looked at the visitor log, there was like 35 or 40 names on it. There were 24 people, members of the club, that participated in field day that year. There was about 30 or 35 total hands there on the weekend, but 24 of them were club members. So you had more general public people coming in and signing our visitor log than you had the actual club members participating. I think because we're easing back into something this year, and we're up against a little bit of a timeline in respect to the PR guys, go with your lighter thing. And if we bonus some more people show up, that's fine. Plus, it also takes the the years that we hit the PR hard, we knew we were going to get more people than normal because of the way we did it. So the people who did the welcoming table at Field Day went all out. There was plenty of things, tons of brochures for those folks to have. And, you know, we blew it out of the water. It was great. It was great having those folks. But I think we need to ease back in.
Designated to handle.
Exactly. And I don't know that we're going to have the dedication from the club to do that this year, just due to the circumstances.
From what I'm seeing right now, we don't.
Exactly.
We don't have the dedication.
Exactly.
We don't have the manpower. Don't do it.
Right. Just do their normal, whatever they're going to do. And
If people want to come out, people want.
and if they want, if they'll find it, you'll do your normal, well, you probably send something to the Vindicator and your local thing. They'll put a little blurb in the paper, and all the clubs are probably going to do that. You got all 3 clubs in Mahoning County, as far as I know, are doing their public field day locations this year. I don't know, I haven't heard a confirmation of 20 over 9, but I know what's the reserve is. What's that? 20 over 9 is not going to do it.
I think they were doing some work.
They're going to do some home stuff still. Makes sense. But I know West Reserve is going to do theirs. So, and generally when the news media comes around, they usually hit at least both those locations. So that's just something.
I see exactly where Dave and you were coming from. Saying that when you put the restrictions are down off the state, they're done. Okay. If you want to be restrictive, you don't want to be around people.
Well, that's a different question. The question we're trying to address right now is this business of, do we want to attract a lot of public or not? Do we do a big PR or do we do the minimum?
I just gave you the answer to the question because do you want the big PR or a little PR?
No, we said.
Oh, we don't want to turn around. We don't want to do anything. So I would say no PR.
I would frame it like this: if we can't commit to giving the public a good experience, then we should commit to not trying to.
That's basically, I'm saying the same thing.
Yeah, Mike.
I think, well, you know, why not in the middle? Because I think even if we do like instead of the media, people, you can do a big PR because a lot of people are still kind of antsy about going out. We may not get a lot of people anyway. You know, I'm going to go out with a bunch of people.
Well, we never said no PR. You have to do something because it's worth our while for part of the field day exercise to do something for PR. But whether we're not going to blast it everywhere, but we'll do our normal. You put something on Facebook, you type up your press release, you send it to your local news media, and be done with it.
Okay.
Just have a table on there so if somebody wants.
Oh yeah, you're definitely going to do that. But
Let's just do the minimal then.
Yep.
I'm fine. We just need to have some direction to get it started.
Yeah.
There's your direction.
Let's do the minimal.
We're not going anywhere with coax if they show up. We don't have to go out.
Right, exactly.
You saw the way we do it. We put a full court press on. We're here. What we've done in the past has not only been the standard media release, but then there's the follow-up to the media release where you literally get somebody on the phone and say, hey, we sent you a link a number of days beforehand, so they put it on their shoot calendar, okay, or their storyboard or whatever. And then you're also going and you're trying to book time on television, especially the early morning and the afternoon shows. There's some of the times they're looking for people. You can get FaceTime on those things. And we've done sometimes all 3 stations locally, all right? Then you get on some of the specialty shows. Then you get on social media. I mean, you start adding that up. That's why we end up with 30 or 40 folks showing up. And it could have been more. So when you do the maximum effort, you get a decent response.
The maximum effort will be tempered by the safety factor.
Well, the point is that we're saying, let's just put out the minimum.
Do the minimum this year.
There you go.
Thank you. You know, it'll be what, about 2 weeks away, so we don't have time for.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we're late if we were going to try to do talk radio or anything else anyway.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
So anyway, I guess, moving on in a general sense, we basically have 3 different motions that we need to make before field day of for spending some different funds. Basically, we'll need, make a motion. In general, we need to make a motion for a portage on. We need to make a motion for general expenses that are cover gasoline for generators, and then we need to make a motion for food. As far as, finalizing formal details, again, I'm just going to ask everyone that would like to come out next week. We'll do that. So any other general questions before I go in and making any motions? Yes, Andy. Oh, go ahead if you want. Or if you know what the numbers, you want.
I move that we, the club rents portage on for field day.
All right.
We got a second.
All in favor? Motion passes.
Whatever we want.
We got that shit out.
Yeah.
So we
So
got
I'll make the phone call indirectly. The price was $115 is what we were looking at. So. I guess I hadn't thought about the general.
Who's second in that motion? Just, I don't know. Okay.
So was that motion on all three items?
No,
No, just the portage on. Just want to make sure we're covered for the portage on.
Just in case we get a motion for the food and we have too much and you need to use the portage.
And then I guess I can make the motion myself, correct? So I'd like to make a motion that we allocate $100 to cover our general expenses for gasoline is the only one I'm expecting. We're not expecting to buy anything, but if anything happens, wire rope.
Yeah, I think we're
minor
actually
things.
pretty good on that kind of stuff.
So I'm proposing a motion to allocate up to $100 to be spent for general expenses.
We got two.
Yeah, pick one.
Who seconded it, John?
John. All in favor?
Aye.
All against? Motion
All right.
passes.
I'll do the motion for the food. I would preface it with a little bit of information. Last several years, we had done field day. Usually on Saturday evening, I was able to get the bulk of a catered meal donated. I'm going to skip that this year, I think. I think we're going to go back to the old hamburger and hot dog cookout picnic meal for Saturday night. Just because I really don't want to ask any of the local businesses for free donations this year. I believe that most of your local businesses and restaurants earn the right to be paid for their food, at least this year. So I'm gonna skip that aspect. And I don't want to go and order a catered meal or anything because we don't know how many people are going to come. A lot of us in this room are, but there's a lot that maybe not, whatever the case is. So I think I'm going to just stick with the old picnic food. Tell everybody if they want to, bring a side dish. If you're coming out, bring a side dish. We'll do the club will do hamburgers and hot dogs and the stuff that goes with that. And we'll do a couple picnic sides too. The club will probably get some baked beans and a couple of things like that you would have at a cookout picnic. For dinner on Saturday. I stress to the members to bring snacks and desserts and cookies and that kind of stuff. And then generally what we do as a club too, and it's been, history for many years, is we always usually do breakfast on Sunday morning for the crews that work overnight or come early enough on Sunday morning to operate. Generally, I do breakfast between 8 and 9 o'clock on Sunday morning. So we'll do that again also. That's not a great expenditure out of the food. That's actually the cheapest part of the food thing because it's easy and that stuff doesn't cost all that much. So we'll definitely do that. And then probably what I'll do for lunch on Sunday, I've got a couple of ideas because, we're there, most of us that are there for the duration of field day, and, we always ask people to stick around to help, tear down. So if you don't come for breakfast and you're coming and operating at 10 or 11 in the morning, and then, you're going to stick around, you usually want to eat around noon or 1 o'clock. So usually we'll throw some hamburgers and hot dogs back on the grill if there's any left. Or I think what I might do this year, and it just kind of piggybacks on what I was saying about supporting the businesses with food, is I think what I might do for lunch on Sunday is just order pizza. That way we could take a poll of the folks that are there. We won't overbuy, but yet we can support, there's 2 or 3 local pizza shops there in the Canfield area that are close enough to the fairgrounds that one of us can run and pick it up, or we can have them deliver it, whatever the case is.
Maybe open on Sunday, B?
Yeah, the couple over there are, yeah. Most of your pizza shops are. They're usually closed Monday or Tuesdays now. So yeah, most of them are. And I'll do some research on that. It won't be that difficult.
So
But
we need a motion and an amount.
I'm gonna do $300. I don't think I'll spend all that much, but until I start buying stuff, the price of everything goes up almost every day right now, unfortunately.
I'll second
So
that motion.
I'll make the motion for up to $300 for field day food.
We have a second on the
Right.
motion.
Second.
Okay.
Who's our secretary?
Well, we kind of don't have one, so I'm just writing down call signs on the motions. Our secretary hasn't shown up for the meeting.
We have a second on the motion. Do I have a yay?
All those in favor?
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All those not in favor?
Did anybody else have any comments on that? I thought somebody raised their hand, but
I was just gonna add that it's every likelihood you can't get it catered anywhere.
Oh,
My wife and I are trying to get a small party for her business catered. We've been trying for a month. Nobody's doing it. They're all turning us down.
wow, that's weird. I order food for work and stuff all the time. I never had, you must be going to the wrong places. I got all kind of
They're not
connections.
taking groups over like 10 people.
Really? That's weird.
Everybody is saying they can't get food or can't get it at reasonable prices and they don't.
I
if
just
they
had a
follow
party for
prices,
125 employees last week and I didn't have any problem
Well,
getting
that
any
might be,
food.
that might be
So
on
you
the
need-
other side of the other side.
Okay.
I guess any other discussion on field day questions or general, or other than that, I'll say, please come see us next Wednesday or get a hold of Scott or myself.
We're very, at least I know I'm very reachable. After I crawl out of bed.
I was gonna say, call before then.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, and if anybody has any suggestions on, things you want to go with the meal Saturday with the hamburgers and hot dogs, I'm open to suggestions. Send me an email. Everybody knows my address. It's not hard to find. And I'm flexible. I'm willing to.
Send it to the club email.
Right. Or yeah, just send it to the club email, WAQOY@ARRL.net. It'll get to us.
Okay.
Thank you.
You know.
All right, thanks, Joe. We have one visitor. Why don't you stand up and introduce yourself, please?
So,
Yeah.
so I'm Luke Legore. I'm a newer member. Got my ticket over the winter. I had to take the test in my bathroom on the toilet. Well, watching on the internet, it was kind of strange, but.
That's why you passed.
Yeah, I passed.
You were in the thinking room.
Yeah.
More ways than.
Hey, did everybody sign the sign-in sheet?
Yeah.
Is there anybody who didn't sign the sign-in sheet? I thought I miscounted earlier.
Nice meeting all you guys. Thanks.
Welcome.
What's it called? KE8OKO.
Okay, yeah, we've got you on the repeater a couple of
Yeah, that's
times.
right, yeah.
Checked in on the nets a couple of times.
Yeah, a couple other nets.
Yeah.
Yeah, I live in the middle of town, so I could hit the Springfield repeater easily, but I can't. I just have an HT.
Should be able to get in a 745, though. Shouldn't be able to.
I've tried a couple times, but I don't think I come through real well. So.
Stand outside.
It's odd that directly. Most of the time I get hit perfect. I sit on a hilltop and pull it. Other days, it's just static.
Okay, well, we hope to see you at field day. Come on
Yeah,
out.
I'm on vacation, so we're going camping.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, okay. I can remember the email.
You're going to your own field
All
day.
right, we got 50-50.
Yeah, anybody want, we need at least one more ticket. We're at $35 for the, poll.
I'll take a ticket.
We're doing, all right. So we have,
We're raffling off this reciprocating saw blade.
wow.
It has an American flag on
It's
it.
brand new, never been used.
Fits the table.
Half the money on reciprocating. Is it all purpose or bimetal?
Okay.
Thin curve, whatever that. Metal, it's a metal one.
What brings it to I don't know. It's a resident.
Yeah.
That was on the table. I don't know what the table was. It's a brand new blade. Everybody does it use.
You loaded it up, right?
They're on my phone.
What's on your phone?
Let's see pictures of my dog.
I'm bringing mine. Mine does. That's a horse. No, it's not a horse. It's more like a bull.
I'm dead, Steve. I have a bull, so.
Okay.
Okay. What else we got to do while we're waiting for him? Is that it?
That's it. That's all I got. You got a treasury report?
Okay, that's $14.
We spent $40. Yeah, I better do that.
Yeah. Dean's gonna.
Let me give the treasurer's report real quick. We didn't do much this last month, but our checking account balance was the start of the month here in June was $7,074.58. We got $7,200.42 in the savings. I had one membership dues paid before I did the treasurer's report here, or this morning, or this afternoon rather. And we did have one disbursement for the month of June so far. We rented the pavilion for Boardman Park for the corn roast in August, which unfortunately, I have bad news on that one, or however you look at it, we're still gonna have a corn roast. We could not get the Masters Pavilion. Somebody had actually rented it like in January or something for our same date. So we might have to crash their party, but we're gonna have the Hofmeister Pavilion, which we've had before in the past. It's just one of the ones out in the middle of the park over there by the kids' playground. The only difference, the pavilion itself is the same physical size, seats the same amount of people, just they don't have the fancy running water and the bathrooms attached right to it. You gotta walk 75 yards to the bathroom instead of right around the corner. But other than that, everything else will be the same. And that only costs us a whopping $40 to rent that. So that's the only expense we had for the month of June so far. Now we'll have more for field day next month.
You got that all split 3 ways there, Mike?
What?
You got that all split 3 ways?
What?
You got that all split 3 ways?
3 ways?
Yeah.
You need bad enough. I've got like splitting. I'm trying to make change.
So anyway, our balance total for the club as of this morning was $14,284.06.
Oh, good.
So we have a good amount of money. We're solvent.
Okay, wasn't really prepared to do this, so. Besides, we have $15 for Jack probably wants to run late here, so.
We don't have a real visitor tonight.
Yeah, we do. Luke.
He's a member.
He just became a member.
Did you join the club already?
This is the first time he's been here.
Yeah, but he joined.
Okay.
He just doesn't do the meeting.
Okay.
Where's that roster at?
Yeah.
Here.
All right, who's our guest? How's he going? New guy. All right, how's Judge you pick?
Luke, what's your last name?
Lenore.
Yeah, he's a member. He joined back in he did an online. I am. I have the template at home. I got to go buy the cardstock to make it. I haven't had time.
Okay.
I'm gonna try to do that this weekend.
One of the
I'm gonna just mail them out. Well, I'm gonna bring them to field day and then
last
I'll
3
mail them. They don't
digits,
show.
388.
Those weren't mine, Mike.
All right, Dave, Brett, what do you want? What would I?
Let me see, keyboard or cash? Such a hard decision, right?
Yeah.
I haven't eaten supper yet, so just what you guys want.
There you go.
You want to confirm?
Okay.
Oh, I suppose.
Oh, yeah. It's the way it works, Dave. I needed.
See if I can bring it
I didn't know keyboard. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Cut that all a little bit. Okay. Hey, come on. How very stunning.
There you go.
All right. Want to get the repeater direction of the keyboard? 410. 410. Late arrivals. 410. That might be easy. That's familiar. Yeah, it is. Okay, I'll say it, Chief. I think more people wanting the repeater directory, so. All right, keep that out. 2019 repeater directories. 380. 380. All right, now.
Look at that, Jack.
That it, Mike? Is that it, Mike?
That's it, thank you.
All right. Can I get a motion to leave? Joe, second. Ed, all those in favor? Yeah, he's got it. Okay, folks, I'm gonna be shutting you down.